Hey everybody, and welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Today we're going to be discussing some of the things we are learning about this week, some of the business developments we're keeping our eyes on, some things that are happening in the AI space at large, and some other things that we kind of find generally interesting. So we hope you've enjoyed the episodes so far. Be sure to check back to all of the places you are used to listening to your podcast, including our YouTube channel, on a weekly basis as new episodes of this Founders Pod drop. So hopping right in, Zach, we'll start with you. Where's this podcast find you?
Currently sitting in my home office. Same as you, Damon. We live here in Durham, North Carolina, especially with Duke University. So yeah, just working in the home office today. So if the soundproofing is not there, you might hear some background noises.
Sounds good. That's good. Lakshay, where are you at?
Yeah, I'm out of Portland, Oregon, in my home from here, and have been here since graduating.
Yep. Shashi, where you at?
I'm in Houston, Texas. It is 61. It's gotten chilly here in Texas, and I'm a little chillier than normal because I got out of the cold plunge about half an hour ago. So core body temperature is still acclimating, but yeah, all good.
Very nice, very nice. Yeah, that's the one thing we haven't really touched on. I mean, most people probably assume, but don't necessarily know, is that ScholarAI is and has been a fully remote company from the beginning. So we've done lots of our work remotely, asynchronously, and that kind of thing. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to doing things like that. So far, we found a really nice cadence and been able to be and remain very productive. But it'll be interesting to see how that kind of evolves over time. So, okay. All right, well, hopping right in. Lakshay, why don't you start us off? What are some of the things that you've been learning about, reading about this week, kind of in the science corner?
Yeah, at least with a lot of the stuff we've been doing. I've been working with some of our engineers very deeply on infrastructure. I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff to learn just by some of the friends I have, and I guess like the space we're in. It's very interesting learning about ways to optimize and manage these like big models that obviously like you have to think about, like you're running on AWS, that costs money. How do you like plan resources correctly? So I've been kind of having the privilege to kind of get really deep into the weeds of like, what are all the levers to pull? What do all those levers do effectively in like all of these models that we have available to us, and especially when it comes to decision making on products and how to implement them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Any kind of precise or interesting findings that you'd like to share out of that kind of discovery, or just kind of still surface level kind of learning yourself?
No, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff. One thing that's pretty surprising to me is that, especially as we're working on database systems, it was pretty interesting to learn that, like, by far, the thing that's been throttling us a lot is databases and just how effective they can really be in just like handing a lot of compute processes. It's actually pretty surprising to how little, at least with the current stuff we're working on, like the GPU is creating a bottleneck. And obviously we're gonna have to keep on like working on GPU systems, and like that's always going to be the core of a lot of these AI tools. But there's a lot of optimizations you can do on the pieces that surround the GPU rather than the GPU itself.
And from a user standpoint, assuming that those systems do become optimized, other than internal cost reduction and making things better from our end, the users could experience what based on these kind of implementations.
Yeah, so we're working on most primarily like the biggest thing we're working on related to these infrastructure changes is something called semantic search, meaning that when you are searching for papers right now, the model kind of does like the lift of converting your query into like a more conventional search, like using what Google does, where it's keywords, using like some sort of params, and we use our own re-ranking to then organize stuff based on what's most relevant to you, right? There's a different methodology of searching that's very much sharing a lot of these powers that all these LLMs use, called embeddings, where your question gets converted into a mathematical representation. And because we have a mathematical representation, we can then find similar content to what you asked versus what's actually out there, right? I mean, we can do all sorts of stuff. Like if you ask a question about, tell me about astronauts and spinal compression in space, normally that would probably be a pretty like clever search that you'd have to pull off on something like PubMed. Whereas a semantic search would just kind of implicitly understand what that question is, find questions that have a sort of similar implicit meaning to that, which should help us get more accurate results. And especially as users have kept on hitting us with really advanced queries, more and more, this should be really possible with this new system.
Yeah, I think looking long term, it always kind of circles back to this idea of more relevant, more actionable information, hopefully in less time, right? And so, like all these systems kind of make up that puzzle that we're trying to build for people, so we can ultimately give them, more value when they're using AI tools like ours and like others. We'll see kind of how that progresses. So, hopping on, Zach, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you're kind of learning about this week?
Yeah, so thinking a lot about kind of the role of AI in research. So like it's obviously something that we reflect on a lot as a group, but today it was kind of like a bunch of different things coming at me from a bunch of different places. So Nature, which for those who aren't aware is kind of the premier scientific publication journal. They published today their kind of top 10 researchers of the year. This year it was top 10 plus one. They actually listed ChatGPT as one of the top researchers, biggest kind of impacts on research this year, along with its kind of main chief scientist over at OpenAI. But so it was interesting reading the article that Nature wrote on ChatGPT, because a lot of it was kind of about how ChatGPT is great for being used in research publications. It can help you look at information. It can help you kind of summarize, write things. But kind of one of the biggest things it kept bringing up was the issue that it is not always giving reliable sources. That's like obviously something we noticed very early on. It's a problem we try to solve. So as I was reading that article, I kept like waiting for ScholarAI to pop up on the next line, but didn't quite happen. Although we have been featured in a few different publications, didn't quite make that story. So like along with that, that was kind of on top of one of my lab members defended today. So got to talk to a lot of people today. Had multiple conversations around a professor who uses ChatGPT in order to help him with his research. Talks about how he struggles to kind of get accurate information or proper citations from it. So I let him know about ScholarAI. So hopefully we have a new user signing up for that today. Additionally, too, just talking with some other people about kind of how AI could be really useful in the journal writing process or article writing process. As we've talked about before, is if you had AI helping you to kind of deal with some of the formatting or some of the things that aren't necessarily the hard research, but word, language tools are really good at, it could be really kind of cool and make research a lot more efficient in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think it's always an objective of ours to do a better job of communicating and sharing the advantages of using ScholarAI over, other systems, so that some of these kind of pitfalls of just the base large language models themselves, like in ChatGPT, are overcome. We know that we're not the only solution in that space, and as long as people are using them and receiving value, then we would like them to use ScholarAI, but so long as they're getting help from somebody, we're very, very happy to kind of push them in those directions. Shashi, about you, what do you learn about?
Yeah, a few different fragments of thoughts. One is we've had conversations with possible partners and possible customers about meta-analysis, and been thinking about how that's a similar concept to another thread we've had at ScholarAI, which is understanding the frontier of what's known and unknown in a space, and kind of more and more seeing those as related branches of kind of features that we can develop in time. So been thinking about that a little bit. We've obviously had lots of conversations with people, on both on the capital side and other ventures in the AI space. And the research process, while kind of very ingrained in its current processes, I think several parts of the work stream, as Zach was saying, will incorporate AI tools to accomplish specific point innovations, which will over time connect together to become bigger and bigger comprehensive innovations. It will feel like the innovation is slow and then the change will happen sort of all at once. So I'm just interested in that process of how the research industry changes, evolves. And just one more fragment of thought, which is compounding research questions with between fields and having AI support the ideation process by pulling disparate concepts together and have those concepts turn into research inquiry and have those then turn into further opportunities for future research.
I think as an additive thought to that, one thing that we've talked about internally and had some discussions with and some other people is this idea of a paradigm shift from purely reactive AI to more of a proactive approach, which is what you're alluding to, which is after we can accurately kind of search and synthesize information that's already available, at what point does AI begin to kind of inspire based on its stochastic nature of what are important questions to ask, who might be best at asking those, how can AI help fill the gaps between one disparate party and another, helping bring those kind of two brains together such that we actually get some sort of AI-enabled research process that leads to hopefully improved scientific discovery. So similarly, kind of on that train of thinking, the thing that I've been kind of fascinated with this week is more relevant to the work that I do in my PhD at times, and it's the idea of biomarker sensing. And so there was a paper in Nature that came out recently that was titled Organ Aging Signatures in the Plasma Proteome Track Health and Disease. And really that's a fairly jumbled kind of sentence there, but the key takeaway is that using AI and specifically machine learning in this paper, they were able to accurately and reliably age people's organs across different cohorts, and that was enabling them to make predictive analyses on kind of people's health span and wellness span, if you will, based on kind of partitioned out on different organs. And it goes to this larger notion of traditionally we have thought about diagnosis almost in a binary. So like COVID as an example, if you have specific proteins or if you have specific nucleic acid profiles kind of circulating in your blood, it's very easy to identify you with these types of diseases. The more advanced AI systems can be collected, compiled, and used effectively, enables us to not just look at one target, but many. And the hope being that the ability to look at many things at once, this idea of kind of a multiplexed analysis of various biomarkers at one time, will hopefully enable some more advanced diagnostics for some harder to diagnose diseases. So kind of said a different way, a disease like cancer doesn't necessarily have a singular biomarker that alerts a clinician to saying, yes, this patient definitively has cancer. That information or that decision, that diagnosis, if you will, is usually a compilation of many tests, usually seen over many clinical visits, that kind of thing. So just one more step into what we hope will be more efficient patient diagnosis, and that will hopefully lead to kind of ultimately better outcomes for people that are dealing with kind of any of these diseases that we ultimately suffer from. So moving on from that, Josh, I'll start with you this time. What kind of in the business world are you kind of thinking about, learning about, reading about now?
Yeah, I'm interested in the AGI conversations, and in particular, just sort of a thought here, a reflection, having read about different approaches to AGI and how we utilize it and where the line of danger is. It seems to me that the line of danger is when AGI gets plugged into sort of a physical presence and gets to adapt to kind of its own nervous system in operating within a physical presence. And so just a thought of where we should be cautious is when we enable the AI to kind of become aware of its own sort of nervous system of a physical presence in the world, especially if that is adaptive. Like when babies are in the womb, they sort of do lots of little micro movements to get acquainted and build kind of a methodology for how do I control this body. And that seems like the area of research where it could create concerns or the kind of behaviors we would really worry about. So that's what I'm thinking about is AGI, and what is that line of research where on the other side of this line presents real concern and danger, and that's that nervous system approach is where I would exhibit some caution.
Yeah, and that feels prescient given some recent news around kind of advances in robotics that are at least seemingly popping up across the web. I think there's a natural extension that is kind of the AI being the obvious brain of what will become advanced robotic systems, and I think there's some debate, like you're alluding to, around what that timeline, what that time horizon might be, how long we are away from that. But I do think it needs to be done with some thoughtfulness, kind of as you're alluding to. I don't know that anyone has the answers right now, but I do think it's an important, space to at least be thinking in currently. Zach, you want to go next?
Sure. I guess you had shared an article prior to this call that kind of talked about Andreessen and Horowitz and kind of the investments they were making. One category where there's a lot of work in the AI space is in the kind of protein engineering, using these large language models, adapting them to be able to kind of build and predict different proteins and enzymes and how they can be used, whether that's designing antibodies to treat a disease, whether that's designing different proteins can be used for even like infertility. So I think that there's a really interesting world where you've got people are finding new uses for these large language models that weren't necessarily the intention of the original kind of creator. So I think the way that I've been kind of thinking about that in the realm of ScholarAI is how do you kind of marry those things together? So you've got these large language models that are really good at language. You have people using the same structure to kind of train different biological systems. How do we, as we kind of continue to build, how do we work with the systems that are out there? How do we understand what's going on in the kind of market to be able to say, we have your interest in this paper, there's a protein being used here, and here's how you can interpret that protein and kind of modify it using these other tools that are being based on large language models. So I don't know. There's just a lot of things that these structures can do. So I'm curious to see what that looks like in terms of how that integrates with the other parts of the AI world and kind of putting those pieces together.
Yeah, it feels like right now a lot of these different applications feel separate. I think what you're alluding to is how these become unified. Like if there's a model that is based solely on helping people predict or analyze protein shape, conformation, function, such as AlphaFold or others, how they begin to start interacting with large language models and how those ideas can kind of be synthesized to ultimately kind of propel things forward, I think is an interesting thought space as well. Lakshay, do you want to extend on any of those or kind of share where you're at?
Yeah, at least on business, the stuff that's been fascinating to me off late has absolutely nothing to do with AI. So I apologize if this is entirely off topic. But if you all know Epic Games, they made this video game called Fortnite. Over the last couple of weeks, they released these like massive collaborations with like Lego, like Guitar Hero, like other video games. I was just pretty impressed how they just like over the last like 2 weeks, like no big announcements, not like some like massive effort or anything. They effectively just like pulled off like the metaverse concept that like Roblox and Facebook have been at the like center of for the longest time. And no one's labeling it a metaverse, which has just been really fascinating to me. Like just throughout the gate, they released like effectively like virtual worlds with different brands, had 2 million something players on one of those modes within the span of days, which is like just super fascinating to me as like how they pulled that off, how much traction it's gotten, how much it has succeeded outside of the terminology of what like a metaverse is and what these virtual worlds are supposed to be. So I've just been pretty impressed with that. I've just been kind of following that. I've never played any of those games, but it's fascinating to me just to hear like what Epic Games as a game company is pulling off in these like business moves that you normally associate with like big tech or that sort of thing.
I think it's always seemed to me like maybe not the highest probability of outcome, but a reasonably high probability of outcome that people, leaders, if you will, in the quote unquote metaverse space would be games companies, right? Game companies already have this in-depth knowledge and experience of bringing people together in a world that is not physical. I think the delineation that we make in our brains is the difference of kind of work and play, right? We have not necessarily thought these video game companies synonymous with professional endeavors, but it feels like a natural extension to simply say, if you're already hanging out in a game space, you're collaborating, why could you not do a virtual meeting? Why could you not do some sort of virtual project, workshop, those kind of things? So I agree. It's interesting. Kind of to double click on your point about the avoiding the vernacular of the metaverse. I think it's interesting in some of the language that companies choose to use. Sometimes they want to be associated with various words. Sometimes they do not. Kind of note at Apple's most recent keynote, they kind of, at least notably avoided using words like artificial intelligence and others, metaverse, as they started to kind of introduce things like the Vision Pro, et cetera. So, again, I think kind of these are all quite fascinating. Josh, do you feel like you want to react to that?
Well, I was going to change gears just a little bit and ask any of you guys if you have a reaction to the Gemini announcement, what was presented and to what degree that it is edited, and whether you think that matters at all.
Yeah, I saw the kind of like deep dive onto like how the presented like I guess showcases were kind of fabricated a little bit. Um, I don't know. I think like ultimately like the means of how these LMs work, like everyone kind of understands it. Like you get enough data, you get enough GPUs, and you like build a model around it, and then everything else is just kind of feature adds on top. So in some way, it's like I'm not. I mean, this was my sentiment before, where like the differential of like, oh, you're like parts of a percent better on this benchmark, you're parts of a percent worse on this benchmark, hasn't felt to me like a significant one. I do believe that Gemini is probably like similarly capable to GPT. It's just a matter of like again where users end up going, how much Google ends up actually pulling people away from ChatGPT. I think that there inherently is probably going to be like a lot of inertia on ChatGPT. Like, are people egressing from ChatGPT aside from the payment? And I'm curious to see what's going to be like now that ChatGPT has re-enabled premium subscriptions. And obviously these numbers are not out there, but very curious to see like what their user retention numbers are like post Gemini, post pausing subscriptions, that sort of stuff.
So you land on, doesn't really matter that they edited the video, doesn't really change your impression.
Yeah, to me, it's like marketing garnish, if anything. Like the capability is not going to be something that like to me is going to be like, oh, like it's 3% different. Come on, guys. Like really, like it's ultimately like a matter of like 3.5 versus 4. That feels like a big leap, but something like, hey, we bumped from 89 to 91% on a benchmark. It's just like marginal for a typical user.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of agree with a lot of what Lakshay said. I feel like we're moving towards, everyone's kind of talked about the fact that these LLMs are going to kind of, equalize out. They're all going to be kind of around the same ability, that it's going to bring down costs if you have different competitors in the space. So I likened it earlier. I was talking to a friend about this earlier today, to where it's like, I think it's going to come down to choosing between, do you like Google Docs better or Microsoft Word better? There might be some things that Google Docs is better at. There might be some things Microsoft Word's better at. So kind of depending on what you're working on, you might choose one over the other. But for like 99% of tasks, you get the same output from both of them. And I think that's probably the way that I've kind of been thinking about Gemini, along with kind of and how it compares to GPT-4. In terms of the marketing, editing, I didn't follow that super closely. I saw that it happened, but like, again, I'm not super surprised that like something you see on the internet is not exactly what the truth is. So
to pick up on that point, Zach, is there so much competition that there really isn't that much value? It seems like these are so well funded. There's so much competition in this foundation LLM space. Do you see that? It seems like the economics just evaporate out of that space through competition. What do you think?
I think that's probably accurate. As I was reading that article Damon shared earlier, it talked about A16Z kind of having ownership in both OpenAI as well as Mistral, the kind of open source large language model. I think at the end of the day, it's almost like they're hedging their bet. It's like, all right, if there's a lot of value in this bigger one, well-funded machine that's this closed source versus this open one, it's kind of like they're going to win no matter which way the market tends to lean. But yeah, I kind of reading that, I think like, it's anytime you have a specialty product, you're the first to the market, you can charge what you want. Prices eventually come down. It's almost, this might not be a fair analogy, but it's almost like pharmaceuticals. When someone develops a pharmaceutical, they have it patented, they're able to kind of charge a premium on that. As that patent runs out and generics are able to kind of join the market, what you get is no one's going to pay the premium anymore because the generics are going to be just as good, just as viable. There's really not going to be that much of a difference. I think we're going to see something really similar in the LLM space. Probably, Gemini, Llama, some of those are going to be kind of the other ones coming at this. And it's obviously a little different than pharmaceuticals because we're not dealing with patent issues. But I think the same thing kind of is there, to where like, yeah, sure, someone was there first, they're best, they're dominant. But at the end of the day, it's going to really be market dynamics are going to impact who's using what.
I think to build on that and extend on a thought that Lakshay expressed earlier, I think there's going to be this question in specific use cases of how good is good enough, and what model can I use at the lowest cost with my preferred security and feature functionality such that I am able to do my task, right? There's always going to be some value in marginal percent gains on the most important of cases, right? You can think about medical diagnoses. You can think about, security surveillance. I mean, there are various industries in which those 2% might be critical and might be worth the added cost that running these models comes with. But for the majority of use cases, like Zach is saying, it might be a little bit of a Coke Pepsi debate on what's your favorite flavor of Google or OpenAI or open source or not. I want to kind of extend it though and throw a question back to you all, and that I keep finding anecdotes, and they may be just that, anecdotes of people increasingly wanting to self-host these LLMs. And I actually posted a link in the in our Slack today about a company that is essentially building a platform in which people can self-host their LLM. So I want to kind of throw a thought at you all, and then feel free to react, any more of you in turn. But this idea that anything that is not run on your hardware is something that you fundamentally don't own. And I know, Lakshay, you and I have kind of bounced ideas about this back and forth, but there seems to be a little bit of a groundswell in that if something is running on someone else's server, meaning you are running it in the cloud, you do not own it on your hardware, then fundamentally there is something different about that experience than if you are running it on your own hardware. And that kind of naturally extends to, if I'm cautious about the knowledge that I want to upload because I'm fearful that my ideas will get out, or I'm fearful that in some ways my privacy will be exploited by uploading my knowledge to these LLM providers, then one option is to run kind of an open source large language model, or even maybe a small language model on a local machine, where functionally, maybe if those models get good enough, you can get the same results without kind of needing to kind of host your knowledge on someone else's server. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I saw that article. I think the interesting conversation that I imagine is going to emerge is just that that article, it used an example of like having like a local like 480 Ti. So basically like top of the line, like what NVIDIA has made available to consumers, like the most modern thing possible. I'm curious as to, I think in like an enterprise case, I can see like reasons that like, okay, like a big enterprise would invest in these GPUs for their employees, and now all of that data stays private. And now you just keep this tool that when you set up at the office, your account has this logged in by default, right? I'm curious as to, and this might just get to like privacy and data like policies more broadly, but I'm curious as to how much of an interest there is on that sort of thing at just like the consumer level. Like I think for a lot of people, in this case with social media, is the case with like browsers, where like there's almost just like a low attachment to privacy, I guess, in regards to like, yeah, this tool is helpful, like I'm fine with it using my data, so be it. But I think in like enterprise cases where people can afford to like invest in hardware for a specific use case, like there it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it depends too on what the company is, what they're doing. Like Lakshay kind of said, is if you're a company kind of using it for your own interior thing, it might be worth it in terms of, I think really the main question is privacy and security. But then, for companies like us or other companies out there that rely on large language models or rely on GPUs, there it's really more of a question of kind of logistics and costs. If we take the privacy part out of it. For us, there's pros and cons to using a model hosted by someone else. Pros, we're not responsible for keeping it up. We're not dealing with kind of that maintenance. We kind of have it, you just turn it on or off. You can use it. It's easy. Cons of that is that we're reliant on someone else. If OpenAI is to have problems, that would cause us problems. If we're using Gemini and Google had problems, that would cause us problems. So there is an argument then for, well, if you own your own systems, you have much more control. But with control comes the same risk of, if our systems went down, then, we're at the mercy of ourselves fixing it. Additionally, too, kind of balancing that cost in terms of how much is it costing you to run your own thing versus how much does it cost to use the other system. So I think at the end of the day, for people who are providing, let's call artificial intelligence services, it's going to be a question of economics, along with a question of comfort and ownership over their process versus relying on other companies. Which was a really long-winded to say. It just kind of depends. I don't know.
Do you think for in the cases where it's important for, as you call them, an AI service provider to kind of own the system, it would make the most sense to invest in the resources to train a new foundational model? Or do you think it would make sense to take something available in the open source, repackage it fine tune it, if we want to call it that, and move on in that direction? Do you have thoughts on pros, cons of those two kind of, competing ideas?
Well, generally speaking, I think just the costs of training a large language model, period, are huge. You look at OpenAI spent tens of millions of dollars training their models. For the average startup, that's not going to be worth it. Additionally, too, I think and again, this it all comes back to what is the 99% use cases? 99% of use cases, an existing open source model like Llama is going to be perfectly adequate. If there's like a specific thing you want to be really good at, like understanding medical documents, you take the existing model, you continue to train on top of it to hit the level of comfort that you need. So I don't really see a use case for companies that are just using the AI in order to kind of provide another service. I don't think anyone is going to be making their own LLMs from the ground up, unless they are trying to be that LLM provider. Oh, happy to hear kind of anyone disagrees with that thought, though.
I think largely I agree. I mean, it does beg the question, though, in that we continue to see VC funding go into companies that are launching new foundational models. And so the kind of natural extension of that thought is, do they think they're going to do it better? Do they simply think they're just going to be multiple winners and they're making a bet that being as good is going to be good enough in order for them to gain some significant market share? I don't know. I mean, again, I'm not as hands-on with the code as either one of you two. So I in some ways, I ask the question because it feels to me like the natural step 0 to 1 is to use what's available in the open source, try to find a way to improve that in the beginning. That said, it feels like other people are operating with the hypothesis that starting from the ground up is a better approach for reasons that I think are unknown to me.
Yeah, I think when you enter the world of capital where like all of a sudden like being able to train over the entire internet yourself makes a lot more sense, like becomes real. Like I can understand the approach for it. I think in regards to like being competitive or like how to justify like what is the better approach. My sense is that like when you're looking at making a new like open source model, right? If you're not doing like what is a relatively different approach from these other LLMs, like to me, it just seems like it's creating like a cheaper competitive step that requires a lot of effort. Like to me, it doesn't make sense as something to do. I think if you're someone like a Stable Diffusion or like Pika or whatever it may be, that's like making like a new approach for a new utility and then selling that as like a model to provide, completely different story, 100% go for it, right? We're seeing that happen with like video generation right now, right? But with regards to like take an open source model, train it up a little bit by yourself, and trying to get competitive to the caliber of like Gemini or ChatGPT, like that just kind of feels like a losing battle in my eyes. But yeah, I think that there are like when you go outside the text range and you look at like innovation, which I assume most of these like startups that are getting funding to build models are doing, like they're looking at like, hey, let's do LLMs a different way, or let's do pictures, images a different way. That's a different story.
So I guess question back to you, Damon, a little bit. You kind of touched on it, is like, why would someone invest in a new startup that says, hey, we want to build a different LLM? What value could you see a company like that providing that an investor could see potential in?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in some ways, it's kind of the question that I have. I think it just comes down to competing thesis on where they think the value is going to be generated. I think you could make a credible argument that in some use cases, a different foundational model would provide improved performance over a competing foundational model. So if they think they're building a foundational model that's going to be engineered for highly valuable specific use cases, and they feel like they have some sort of secret sauce to do so, then I think you could make a logical argument that it makes sense to invest in that space. Alternatively, I think it could just be true that, VCs sometimes just make bets on markets being large enough that multiple winners are going to arise. And they may just simply not believe that the entire market is going to be serviced by Google, OpenAI, and the other, players in the space, whether it be open source, Meta, et cetera. So I don't know. I mean, I really don't. I think that one of the kind of fascinating and really kind of energizing things about building in this space and trying to build a company in this space, as we're doing right now, is how many unknowns there are. It can be, quite frustrating at times when things change quite quickly. But I think a lot of these questions that we're discussing right now, we'll watch them play out over the next 5, 10 to 50 years. So kind of want to leave kind of the realm of everything else that's happening and kind of turn the focus a little bit back on ScholarAI for a moment. I know Zach and Lakshay, you guys have been putting in lots of work over the last few days, few weeks to make some progress towards a web app that we have coming out soon. So does anyone want to tell us a little bit about progress there, what users can kind of expect, those kind of things?
I'll go for it. Yeah. So we, as Damon mentioned, we're working on a dedicated web app. Obviously, a lot of our users, like, they're disappointed when they hear about our tool and hear about the ways people have been able to use us and get value, but they realize, like, okay, you have a tool. I'm first have to pay for ChatGPT, access that first, and then I can get the ability to even try your tool out, right? And so we are working on a dedicated web app so people can use ScholarAI without needing to have ChatGPT Plus. For now, it's going to be very simple, like just like all the features you come to expect. But we're really hopeful for it because obviously now that we're on our own platform, we're hosting our own pages. That really gives us the opportunity to really optimize for what do our users, what do our customers like really want value out of, right? We can make our own UIs. We can like help you guys work through papers. We can help you guys understand like very deeply, like, hey, how are these papers connected? We can explore the literature map in our own UI. It really opens up a lot of potentials. And I think one thing that's going to be really exciting is once that's out there, like the product sort of like conversation, talking with customers, like kind of being like almost one-to-one with what do people want? What can we make? Becomes a lot easier when we're outside of the scope of just needing to be an API.
And I think one of the natural benefits that comes with that is what you're alluding to is this idea of user customization, not necessarily on a singular user level, but the idea to be able to deliver features that we simply cannot deliver in the singular chat interface that is ChatGPT. That said, we're always going to strive to provide users value no matter where they find us, whether that be the ChatGPT plugin, the ChatGPT GPT, which is a little bit of a difficult thing to parse together, and kind of whatever the evolution of those ecosystems look like. I know that we've also explored building in areas like browser extensions and trying to embed ScholarAI systems into other workflows, whether that be the Microsoft suite or the Google suite of products. I think that our central goal is to provide users incredible value, and we're going to continue to find ways to do that. The dedicated web app is something that I'm very excited about because I'm very excited to get that out to users and see what their response is, see what we learn about ways that we can help them do more work in less time, we hope. So, Zach, any thoughts to add on the development of the user app overall?
Yeah, overall, I'm just excited. I think that this has been something we've talked about really since we built the plugin in the beginning is, it'd be cool to kind of be able to do this ourselves. I think it gives us a lot more access to our backend information. So as our users knows, when you search for abstracts, you really only return 4 different abstracts. Now, you could envision you hit the search through the chat, but then you have a panel on the side that just gives you all of the papers that came back. And, maybe paper number 15 was the one that was actually really interesting. So just click a button that says, oh yeah, add paper number 15 to my contacts. It loads it in, and then voila, you're working with the more relevant paper. That's, I think, kind of where we see ourselves going, is that interactivity between the chat along with kind of the more API, more software things. So I think there's a lot we can do with that. And as we build it out, we have now the control of the process. We're not limited anymore by just being a plugin on ChatGPT. So I'm really excited to see kind of where this goes and what people's feedback is.
Yep. I think extending that thought slightly is in kind of harkening back to what we spoke about earlier in this conversation. This idea, this eventual movement from reactive to proactive is only possible in a system that kind of deeply understands what users need, the projects they're working on, and kind of how we can best serve them the information that they're kind of requesting on a fairly regular basis. Joshi, any thoughts?
I wanted to raise the question of the underlying LLM of the web app. In time, the flexibility that we'll have by having our standalone application and our ability to experiment, utilize different LLMs or experiment with different underlying LLMs to help us serve our customers. Do you guys want to speak to that?
Lakshay, you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So right now we're building on OpenAI. It just makes development fast. Obviously, them being the leader. But hopefully, as the web app develops and if it gains traction, that gives us a lot more room to then play around with different LLMs, different models, as the backend that we can natively support to run all these features. Right. That has benefits for infrastructure, so that way, like when you guys are using the tool, you're not relying on two companies' availability. You're relying on just how well we're running our software. But of course, that also gives us the room for flexibility to plug at different models, use what might be, the most modern at a given moment if OpenAI for whatever reason lags behind. So we'll keep on moving forward. Of course, as we're releasing, it's just going to be like pretty similar to the OpenAI experience that you have already, just more access, hopefully. And as time goes forward, it will be able to grow into a lot more things.
Yeah, I think kind of like building on top of that is you could almost envision a world where the pro being that we can use different models, we can use different configurations. It's a little bit plug and play. You could even have like a selections, like maybe you want to use this specific model for some reason it's better at something. So it can even give the user a little bit of control of, today I want to use the OpenAI version, or tomorrow I want to use the Google version. I may be oversimplifying, but you can see use cases where there might be a more specific fine-tuned model that you want to use in your specific realm of expertise, as opposed to just the more generic model. So we have a lot of options. When the user's going to have access to their own profile, be able to choose different settings. So some of that can be related to eventually is which model am I using, or what kind of are my defaults along that.
It feels like the step there needs to be when desired, user selected, otherwise kind of almost automatically programmed such that the anticipated best response is delivered. Feels like, if we can be the menu provider of come here with your research, allow us to enable you to do better work, again, kind of in less time, kind of however we get there, that's going to be kind of where we always lean, and the ability to swap in models as appropriate just feels like a natural extension of delivering that kind of ultimate user value.
Yeah, because there are some scientists out there who like to do things a certain way and are not super flexible in that. Not that I've ever met any of them, but so any sort of customization we can use that is intuitive and makes sense and we can offer as a feature. Like I'm excited to see what we can offer now that we have a lot more flexibility.
So I kind of want to return to a conversation that we paused a little bit last week as we ran out of time, and that is this idea of chips, primarily hardware GPUs that are used to train and help run these large language models being a bottleneck that was discussed in kind of the realm of Sam Altman's proposed or alleged new chip startup that was kind of reported as being a rival to NVIDIA. I want to touch on that, especially because as of recording of this podcast, OpenAI has now turned on or restarted the ability to sign up for ChatGPT Plus subscriptions, which, as we know, has been bottlenecked basically for a little over a month now because of what they say is a lack of GPUs. And I feel like that's a reasonable thing. But it does feel like it is a repeated bottleneck and kind of interesting topic. So, Josh, maybe we'll start with you. What was kind of your reaction to both the idea that the chips are a bottleneck, and then as a result of that, Sam Altman's progress or kind of implied moves to maybe help alleviate this bottleneck?
Yeah, a couple of different thoughts. First, I've been reading about efficiency innovations in training and methods to train models that could be done much more efficiently than the current process of training. So I expect there to be innovation in that space where there is such a dramatic cost, tens of millions of dollars to train a large language model, and even significant cost to train small language models, that there will be efficiencies there in terms of how do we train models and how do we make that process a lot less expensive for most use cases. So I can certainly see innovation happening there to drive down cost. With that said, hardware will continue to be a really important bottleneck step. The demand for hardware will only increase, and NVIDIA certainly has accrued a lot of value and will continue to accrue a lot of value as the dominant player in that space. But I expect there to be more innovation on the hardware side. I expect Google, for example, to leverage more of their hardware expertise to play in that space Apple certainly has an opportunity there to play in that space as well with their M series chips. So there could be more innovation in that hardware space given the amount of value that is present. But simultaneously, I think there will be the innovation in leveraging the existing hardware more efficiently. I can certainly see from the board perspective if Sam was financially benefiting from the development of a new chip that he was in a position to partner with from OpenAI, that would appear like a really important conflict of interest. I don't know whether that was part of the conversation, the issue that led to his termination, but I can certainly see how that would be a significant point of friction.
Yeah, and just to punctuate that point, I do think there were several reports that OpenAI was set to buy chips from this kind of newly envisioned startup. And again, without getting into the weeds of what that means one way or another, I do think it just emphasizes that at least the people who are seemingly very close to these models do see significant value in creating at least redundancy in the chip supply, if not improvements in the chips. So, Lakshay, any thoughts on kind of the burgeoning chip wars, if you will?
Yeah, one thing, I mean, I don't know if OpenAI has like said about how their like current infrastructure lives or exists, but obviously they got started or got a lot of their momentum from like that Azure partnership. So a lot of their GPUs, I assume, were like hosted on Azure. I'm curious as to if in this modern development of like, oh, we got more GPUs is like a business thing with like Azure where it's like an agreement for more uptime, or if it's literally that they're beginning to like buy chips, host on their own premises and like own basically like their server center. That's just not something I'm aware of if anyone does know. But in any case, I think like obviously it's going to continue to be an issue. I mean, in general with like chips, that's just like the foundation on which technology exists. So anywhere where it's lacking, anywhere where it's inaccessible is going to continue to be a problem. If innovation happens, it's great, but it's more so like there's just so much that goes into physical product that, you know, being in software, we're able to overlook, but being able to like own a supply chain, manage how stuff is distributed, manage like a full on fabrication process is like a very, very different story. That's just, it sounds a lot harder than, you know, spinning up like a AWS like file, you know?
Yeah, I think it's an important point, and actually something that we should touch on next week is in the difficulties of building a hard tech or a physical goods tech startup. The complications that come with hardware that are usually much more capital intensive and like you're saying, can be much more risky because it requires more upfront investment sometimes, and you can't pivot nearly as quickly on kind of product iteration. So, Zach, any closing statements as we kind of round out this podcast?
Not too much on the specifics of that. I think as you start talking about manufacturing hard goods, so my background, for those who aren't aware, is in chemical engineering. So I actually worked in chemical manufacturing for about 6 years prior to getting my PhD. So I have had plenty of headaches related to supply chain. I have seen people try to make new products on pre-existing equipment. So all of those issues you're talking about, Lakshay, are very real. They are yeah, it's a lot different than clicking a few buttons when you have, you know, gallons and truckfuls of different chemicals sitting in the yard and have to deal with, obviously something that's related to chips is either hazardous materials or, kind of rare metals, things that are hard to get. So then you have all sorts of questions about supply chain. How are you impacting the environment? Lots to tease out kind of along that whole thread. So yeah, it's definitely interesting things to think about as you think about, you know, it's easy to talk about the online world, but what does that physically look like? You know, these servers that we're running, where are they actually sitting? That kind of stuff is cool to think about. And it's interesting as it's kind of coming into play, all this conversation around chips.
Well, excellent. That'll wrap it up for this week's edition of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Thanks everyone for joining. Be sure to leave your comments below. Let us know what you're liking about this, what you maybe like us to talk about. If you've got comments, want to inject yourself in the conversation, we would be more than happy to hear from you. So please make sure to catch us next week when this goes live. Thanks.